Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, joining us is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, we have one data point for you all today. Obviously, we are coming to you on a different day of the week than normal. We are recording this on a Wednesday rather than Thursday. Of course, that is one day after the US election. And the data point there is the obvious one, 270 electoral votes. That is the number, at least, that has been earned by Donald Trump. He's already cleared that number, which means that Donald Trump will be the next U.S. president.
Now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States.
Voters express deep frustration with the Biden administration and former President Trump and the future
for
president.
a second time, this time after having served for 4 years, then disputing the 2020 election.
Our country has never seen before nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
Obviously, we spent the past year talking about Donald Trump in various ways. And in fact, last week we talked about just how much he may be changing the trajectory of the U.S. economy. Today, we'll be talking about how a new Trump administration may affect the rest of the world, or at least that's mostly what we'll be talking about. But first, Adam, before anything else, to talk about this election in terms of U.S. economics, before we turn to the rest of the world, seems necessary. You know, there's been a lot of talk about inflation as the number one factor on the U.S. public's mind. Do you think that inflation is the number one economic factor that helped tip this election in Donald Trump's favor, or are there other economic issues, do you think, that played a bigger role?
I mean, people say this election wasn't about substance, which I think is fair. But I think the economic issues were on the ballot here in a weird kind of way. I think there are three, right? Inflation was one, insistently harped on by the GOP and to quite considerable effect, I think. The others were protectionism on tariffs, whatever the most beautiful word or whatever Trump likes to call it, and then migration. And, viewed from the point of view of a holistic understanding of economic policy, all of those are economic policy issues. And I think they all went Trump's way. And I think it's fair to say that the Kamala Harris team, if she had strong points, it was not in fielding questions on economic policy. And they did not manage to craft a robust narrative that separated them from the Biden administration. And so I think they got hurt on, above all, the inflation issue. On protectionism, you could say that the GOP was even more protectionist than the Democrats are. On migration, the Republicans hammered the Democrats hard, but de facto, the Biden record was fairly restrictive, at least in terms of the intention of policy. The GOP managed to cook up an issue around migration. And of course, that is so heavily freighted. We talked about it in the live recording in DC. Like, it's so heavily freighted with race that it's a little bit abstract to talk about it as simply an issue of economics. I do think the economic issue par excellence of this election was inflation. And it's a really sensitive issue also within the Democratic camp, because as we know, and we discussed this on the show as it happened, like there was a row going on within the Democratic coalition about what good economic policy was. And in the postmortems that have already begun to appear, there is finger pointing and saying, oh, you screwed it up because you did that big early stimulus. And so if you think of policy, if you think of inflation as a variable that's essentially driven by policy, then you might be tempted to say the Democrats, the Biden administration, criminally underestimated the significance of inflation and should have done more about it and should have been more conscious in their macro policy, because in the end, that's what killed them. And I think that's a consistent point of view. I just don't think it's terribly accurate about this particular presidency. My own view is that these were two presidents, in sequence, two incumbents that were basically failed. First, Trump in 2020, who at the beginning of that year was, odds on to win by a large margin. And I think the Biden presidency as well, which on the basis of the macroeconomic evidence, you would say should have been a strong shoo-in as well. But in fact, it's the roller coaster of COVID, the COVID shock, the supply side shocks that did for both of them. It did for Trump first. And then the price shock that came afterwards was not, in my view, in large part a result of policy errors. It was largely something that was inescapable. And so the choice facing the Biden administration was not more inflation. Shall we pursue an aggressive policy at the cost of inflation? It was, there's inflation coming. Shall we throttle the economy to try and stop that? Or should we run a relatively high risk but full employment orientated strategy so that at least when the inflation hits, we're not suffering, unemployment crisis as well. So what they avoided was stagflation, and they opted to run the economy hot. And by any reasonable measure, it was an absolute Goldilocks scenario. And American workers, the vast majority, come off well ahead. But that's not what it felt like on the roller coaster. The hawks are saying implicitly, well, you should then have done everything necessary to stifle the inflation. I just think they totally underestimate the price of doing that. And that alternative scenario is not one in which the Biden administration triumphs by way of stifling inflation. It's one in which the Biden administration loses because it has a full-on recession on its hands or stagflation on its hands. So I think this was actually a difficult hand that was dealt to the Democrats in 2021. And in terms of macroeconomic management, they handled it about as well as anyone could have. And in the end, what they should really have done is, broken early with Biden, nominated a new candidate, and that person should have run hard against the Biden administration on this issue, for 12 months, saying we're going to do everything differently and, distancing themselves, building some political space, which would have given them a chance perhaps to shed this incumbency effect, which they've otherwise become victim to. So that would be my own read on this. Inflation clearly hurt. I think it's unfair to attribute it to the administration's policy, but that's, the nature. They won by virtue of Trump being blindsided by COVID. They lose by being blindsided by post-COVID price shocks. That's the nature of this game. It would have taken a far more far-sighted and less precious, less self-satisfied Democratic leadership to say, if we're going to have any chance at all in 2024, we need to start prepping in 23. And of course, that was well beyond their political capacities.
Okay, so let's then turn to the rest of the world, starting with Europe. Europe does seem like potentially the big loser in this election. There's a lot of talk I've seen already about how this is a wake-up call for Europe, and it dawned on me that people have been talking about these wake-up calls now for many years. In fact, at least 8 years since Trump was first elected to be president. I'm curious whether, in fact, empirically, is Europe better prepared or prepared at all to autonomously defend itself and its interests now compared to 8 years ago when Trump was first elected? And if not, just, I'm a bit shocked. How can that be the case? I mean, what then has Europe been doing in that time?
I mean, it's such a fair question, Cam. And as you say, like the wake-up call metaphor just brings home like this thing. Europe's been hitting the snooze button for decades. Literally over and over again, this message has been sounded out. And you're, in Berlin at the heart of, the dopiest part of the European political system right now. Germany boasts of having raised its defense spending in the last couple of years to 2% of GDP, but it only gets there basically by some fancy footwork in the budget. The regular defense budget of of Germany is still stuck at 1.2% of GDP. And the rest is add-ons in the form of a special budgetary fund they created and counting money they give to Ukraine as German defense expenditure. There has not been, despite all of the rhetoric, a fundamental shift in the understanding of what defense would involve. And that would be not, Germany breaking out of the existing fetters, but it would be moving defense spending to something closer to 3%, which would take it to 120 billion euros a year, which would be enough to give Germany the chance to rebuild the damage done to its defense capital stock through neglect over many years. It might give them a chance of hiring some people, and they could buy some new military kit and become a truly cooperative and large-scale player in the European system, which is where this all should go, because altogether the Europeans spend easily enough money, pushing towards 300 billion euros or more now, to provide for their own defense against Russia easily. But they do actually need to do it in a concerted way. And there are players in the system which are doing that. I mean, Poland, for instance, has raised its defense budget to 5% of GDP, given that the Polish economy is much smaller than that of the German. That now means that Poland's defense spending is on a par with the regular defense budget of Germany. And that just means Germany is not even trying. So, you could argue about whether it's healthy for the Polish economy to spending 5%. That's 1 in 20 of all euros or zloty spent in the Polish economy are defense related. That's a heavy burden. That's Cold War era in the United States in the late 50s, something like that. But that's an indication of a democracy taking this problem seriously. And the short answer to your question is no, because Germany in particular just refuses to understand that history will require it to change the budgetary framework that it is, stuck within. I'm not even, to be honest, particularly sanguine about the prospects of the political system there sorting itself out. We may have cause to do an episode about Germany in the not too distant future if the coalition there falls apart. But to just give a concrete illustration of what happens. So Germany in 22 realizes, oh God, no, we don't have the capacity to defend ourselves. What do we need to defend ourselves against? Well, let's just assume there isn't a ground invasion. What is it that Russia might do? Well, it might lob missiles like it's doing at Ukraine. So then what should we have? Well, we need some sort of missile defense system. So let's launch a missile defense system. So the German Chancellor in August 2022 launches this thing called Sky Shield. And apparently without serious consultation with the French or any other partners, proposes that the money for the Sky Shield should be spent on US Patriots and Israeli Arrow systems, which, on the face of it is, these are good kit to buy, but they didn't coordinate this effectively with the French. And so the French go off in a sulk, refusing to cooperate with the Germans and try and launch their own program. And then 2 years later, you have the Poles and the Greeks proposing an EU-funded program for the entire, European area. So that's the kind of shenanigans that go on, where Germany says, right, we're, Zeitenwende, the change of times, we're going to spend tens of billions of euros on the missile defense system. The logical way to do this is as a pan-European one, but that would require you actually to do the political work of building that coalition. And do they do it? No, they don't. They simply go to the politically opportune combination of Israeli. They signed the deal with the Israelis just weeks before October 7th. And the American Patriot system. Now, these are good systems, but if Europe wants to be strategically autonomous, it would be worth investing in its own capacity. And Europe hasn't even breached the challenge of actually having any kind of deterrent counterstrike capacity of its own. So it's building itself a shield, notionally at least, if they can agree which one of the three projects they're going to pursue. But it's not actually acquiring what we now know war waging requires, which is the capacity to strike your enemy. That question isn't really even being seriously broached yet. In the end, it's quite likely they're going to equip some of the new F-35s with cruise missiles. They'll buy Tomahawks, American kit, something like that. And as you say, this question was, really put on the table in 2017 at, one of the, these famously dysfunctional NATO summits early on with Trump, when he really looked like he was going to storm out and break up the entire alliance. And Angela Merkel at the time said, oh, wow, we really are going to have to stand on our 2 feet. And have they actually shown, as under her administration, any more than under Scholz, any real determination from where the real money power is in Europe, namely in Berlin, to act on this? You really can't say they have. So they've got it coming to them, to be absolutely honest. America really does have other priorities. It's not at all unreasonable for Europe to aspire to or to be asked to deliver on its own defense. I really have profound sympathy here with the American position, which is quite bipartisan at this point. In every respect, it's incomprehensible that supposedly mature sovereign European states just basically don't provide for their own defense. Unless, of course, you're going to say we're not doing our own defense. Fair enough. But in that case, why waste the money they do waste? But really opt one way or the other.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here for now, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the second Trump administration and its effects on the rest of the world. So what if we were to shift perspective a bit further east to Ukraine, namely? That is a country that has also been part of Trump's platform. He promises to end the war in Ukraine on terms that seem to include allowing Russia to keep the territories it is already occupying. Probably does not include security guarantees for Ukraine or further U.S. support for Ukraine's defense. I'm curious, is it conceivable that Ukraine, in some version of a ceasefire arrangement under those terms that Trump could pursue, is it conceivable that Ukraine could just get overrun entirely by the Russian military at some point in the future?
I think that was the fantasy we had when we didn't know what Ukraine actually was. And that clearly there were some experts who had a much better grasp on this than your average, economic policy person like me, who just looked at Ukraine's GDP numbers and thought this place doesn't work. And I think this was the prevailing view also in Washington, to be honest, and for most of the capitals of Europe, that somehow Ukraine could fall in that way, right? That it would simply disintegrate and that Russia will be able to establish political power in Kyiv, and then they would establish some compliant government. And that was obviously a profound misreading of the place that Ukraine had become since 2013, which was a much more resilient, much more committed, much more organized and capable, and therefore also capable of resistance, a state which really was a state. And if we're in that world, however exhausted Ukraine is, after the sacrifices they've already made and given the experience they've already gathered, the prospect of Russia occupying or overrunning Ukraine, especially given the depleted state of the Russian military at this point, just I think becomes entirely unrealistic. I mean, they have an army in the field of hundreds of thousands of men. Even occupying and dominating a city like Kyiv, which is a city of 2.9 million people, would be a huge challenge, let alone a really big country of 37 million. That's the same population as a place like Iraq, and we know how well America did in controlling Iraq. So I think overrun is not on the cards, nor would I expect the Russians to attempt any such thing. I mean, they've also shown very little aptitude for long range, long distance, and we would be talking hundreds of miles deep penetrations. They've really not shown much aptitude or interest in doing that kind of maneuver, which is very high risk, exposes you to flanking attacks. If the Ukrainians could summon any kind of resistance, the Russians would be very, very vulnerable. So that seems an unlikely scenario, but one of nibbling, of threatening, of creating impossible situations for civilian life to continue. All of that, I think, is what we should expect to see, and a consolidation of Russian grip and an expansion of the Russian grip in the territory it already occupies. But the sort of scenario of them overrunning Ukraine, I mean, hell, we've been wrong so many times about this war. I feel like I'm setting myself up to be wrong again, but that just does seem like an old idea that came from the era when most Western analysts, and obviously also the people around Putin, imagined that you just had to sort of push Ukraine and it would fold, quote unquote, collapse, quote unquote, and then you would overrun it. And that we know now that that's not how this goes down, right? So even if, frankly, my concern is if the government in Kyiv attempts to negotiate a peace, will large chunks of the Ukrainian population, or large enough chunks of its population and political system and military, even be willing to go along with that? Or will they attempt last-ditch struggles, sabotage? Could this turn into a bitter civil war between parts of the Ukrainian establishment, polity and society that are willing to, at this point, in some way settle and will feel that the pressure from the US decides that? And the last ditches, if you think about, processes of disputed peacemaking like this, that's the sort of scenario you have to begin to worry about. And as recently as 2021, right, ahead of the invasion, when Kyiv dispatched Ukrainian negotiators to deal with, I think it was the governments of the occupied territories, they're particularly odious and illegitimate entities. There were forces in the Ukrainian parliament that then had those people brought up, I think, on treason charges because they were parleying with the enemy at a time of war. And that was before the war, and that was before the sacrifices and the heroic resistance that Ukraine has mounted. So the difficulties of building a political front for conciliation within Ukraine, I'm sure there are people who are saying, well, thank God Trump's been elected. At least somehow this will come to an end now because we can't go on. But, you could not, how could you blame them given the prospects at this point? But there are going to be people like that, and there are going to be last ditchers who simply can't accept that outcome. And they will have friends in the West as well and in Europe. And so, there's already quite a lot of kind of, op-edding of that type going on, a lot of think tank rumbling. So we have the makings here of a real running sore, I think, to use a rather unfortunate image.
Well, to shift to a different issue, I wanted to ask about climate change and climate policy. To the extent that Trump has a climate policy, it's really more like the absence of a climate policy. It seems pretty certain that he would have the United States exit the Paris Climate Accord. And I'm curious, just overall, if the United States rolls back all of its regulations and laws meant to pursue climate policy and also exits this international framework for pursuing international climate goals. Yeah, what will that mean for climate policy in a global sense? I mean, will it be even possible to sort of keep the current framework of pushing to stop climate change in an international sense of the sort that we've had with the Paris Climate Agreement so far?
Well, the Paris Climate Agreements have a flexibility that's already been tested, right? Because they were signed with great brouhaha with the Obama administration very much playing a leading role in 2015. And then within a short space of time, America was exiting. And they continued on anyway. And both Europe and China gathered climate policy momentum very dramatically from 2018 onwards. And the Chinese made their historic commitment to neutrality by 2060, ostentatiously before the American election, as if to say, this is to project this onto them is already to suggest perhaps too much American concern as part of Beijing's calculus. But it was as if they were saying to Washington, we do climate policy regardless of where you're coming at this from, because this is China's problem to a huge extent. This is Asia's problem to an even bigger extent. The United States is an important factor, but it isn't any longer the dominating factor. And whether or not there's a market for America's oil and gas exports will depend ultimately on its customers, not on the United States. Though, of course, United States producers can, as they have been doing, keep cutting costs and try and stay competitive that way. But they are ultimately going into the teeth of, Saudi and Qatari competition. So good luck with that. That's going to be a really tough road to hoe. So I think it's important to say that despite the rhetoric about leadership from the Biden team, no one who's serious about climate policy at the global level has been counting on America. Structurally speaking, it's not a credible in the sense of game theory of economic policy, credible player. Because if you look at America's underlying interests, which now include the largest oil and gas industry in the world, why would you expect a country which has assiduously fostered that interest and that industry to be a reliable, net zero player? You just it's sort of foolish to imagine that. You can, of course, from the liberal point of view in the US, do your best to drag America in the direction of the green energy revolution, but there are going to be very powerful countervailing forces, and Trump very deliberately, very explicitly articulates all of those. The really peculiar thing is he's now obviously best buddies with Elon Musk, the centerpiece of whose fortune is a truly world historically important innovation in the green energy space, which is huge in China. So maybe in that Trumpy way, in the end, the weird mix of the cocktail that he brews up will be slightly less toxic than it seems at first. Broadly speaking, I think this is a continuation of American policy, which is, as famously as Obama put it, all of the above. America will do fossil and it'll also do green. It'll also do battery-powered energy. It'll do it like in Texas. It'll do oil and gas, and it will do wind and solar. Why? Because America's about more, right? And so it'll just do more and more and more in that vein. And I think that's going to be the continuity. As far as China is concerned, they're doing the green energy revolution because, it's a hugely innovative, important, world-transforming technological set in which they completely dominate. And there was always something slightly quixotic, and I criticized it amply in the exaggerated talk by the Biden people about trying to establish America as a competitor in that space. And, there's a sort of dash of realism in Trump shrugging and going, you've got to be kidding. Except, of course, Tesla's there, and Tesla really is a big player. And so I think it's open-ended. From the point of view of the climate cause as a commitment to net zero and treating climate change seriously, it's staggering, right? But that's no longer what climate politics is about. It's about green energy at this point. So, there's a sort of ambiguous response. It is, it surely will go down in history as a very remarkable fact that as the election was being held, America was hit by these double hurricanes, which did huge damage to large parts of the United States, which can be in a fairly straightforward way attributed to, oceanic warming, and precipitated just vast damage. We think the high side estimates are enormous, hundreds of billions of dollars, and havoc. And yet, climate wasn't an issue in the election. The winning side, was particularly skeptical amongst Trump supporters. I think 10% admit that climate is a serious issue for them, which is a kind of demonstrative screw you to everyone else. Like, it's kind of a remarkable instance of post-factual politics. So you could say in 2020 the same with COVID and the GOP's basic refusal to get on board with vaccination, despite the fact that it's Trump's great triumph. But so there's a strand here, and I think the rest of the world has to just recognize this fact about American politics, that things like vaccinations are good for public health, or climate change is real and a real pressing danger for real people, and not terribly well socialized in the United States.
Yeah, that is maybe why I wonder whether the Trump administration's policy will sort of be indifferent to sort of energy transition in some sense, or like ideologically opposed to it, and using trade policy to actively like oppose, the spread of green technologies. I could imagine that being the case.
Yeah, that's a key point, because what Trump certainly will do is give fossil fuel interests space for their rearguard action. It's not quite as egregious as it was in 2016, where he actually harped on coal as the fuel that he was going to, support. And I mean, we're not quite in that space, but he did have the meeting, didn't he, at Mar-a-Lago, where he, basically offered to sell energy policy to the fossil fuel industry for the donation of $1 billion. In the end, it seems that he got the deal that he wanted with Elon's, and that sorted out his finances. But yeah, that is one of the real worries. But the problem, of course, is that the Biden administration had its doors open to fossil fuel interests too, and in fact, at various points, was egging them on to increase expand. So, even if it were the case that fossil fuel interests have an even more established entree, I wouldn't bet against the possibility that a next era or one of these green players could get Trump's ear as well. And if you explain to him, how much, does anyone ask this? Does Mar-a-Lago have solar panels? Like, if someone explains to him the benefits of actually just kitting out your mansions with solar panels, do we really think Donald will say no? He doesn't seem like that kind of guy. Like, if you actually explain to him that it's free, and it's cool technology, my sense is that he's the sort of person that probably somebody's already investigated this and there's an answer to this question. But I think we misunderstand him if we think of him as a dogmatist at that level. But who knows?
Fair point. Well, then I wanted to end by asking about the perspective on this election from China. You mentioned China in the context of climate policy and the energy transition. I'm curious, in a more general sense, whether China was invested in this election so much at all. We talked about it last week, and more generally, often in the United States, as the most consequential election in U.S. history. Did it seem that way from China, and when it came down to this choice between Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? And maybe another way of putting that is, do the Chinese take U.S. democracy seriously from a kind of historical perspective in the first place?
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually, visiting China over the summer and watching the way in which the Chinese follow American politics. It's almost the way that a lot of Chinese men in particular follow European soccer, because like men's soccer in China is notoriously bad, but they're heavily invested in the fate and fortunes of European clubs. So there's a sort of vicarious participation in democratic politics, as if through a glass wall or something, where that's what happens there, and you watch it because it's fascinating for political science nerds, and their own politics doesn't yield that kind of excitement. I actually happened to be having breakfast today with two China watchers / America watchers from China. And the consensus there was, A, that Trump actually has a fair number of fans in the United States. His kind of hyper-masculinist, business-orientated, brash, political style goes down well with a certain Chinese audience. In fact, some folks were willing to go as far as to say that if, the denizens of Weibo or one of the other Chinese social media sites were fully enfranchised, Chinese citizens, China would have had a Trump the day after, day before yesterday. Like, that kind of politics would go real well. And the consensus over the breakfast table was that they would have made an attempt to invade Taiwan some time ago, because, if you actually unleashed the forces of populist democracy in China, it would be an awesome spectacle. So there was also that kind of resonance. Sitting more coolly and looking at this, I think the consensus is probably that there was some hope at the beginning of the Biden administration that the Biden team would walk back from the place that the Trump team had ended up in 2020. Because they've really traveled a long way, right? From the beginning of the Trump administration, where Trump's position on China was trade policy orientated, tariffs, quotas, that kind of thing, to the redefinition of the Pentagon's mission in terms of the Chinese pacing threat, to phase one of the trade deal, which was still Trump in do a deal kind of mode, to the escalation of anti-China policy on a very ideological, geopolitical kind of level in the course of 2020, and with Pompeo and O'Brien and a whole, tiers of like ultra hawkish, ideologically driven anti-China folks within the Trump administration. And there was some hope that Biden and his team would walk America back from that. And of course, nothing of the sort. In fact, what's happened is there was a sort of sorting out, a more coherent, but in the end, no less confrontational or aggressive position from the US. Less possibility, I think, in the end of a deal. With Trump, I think the consensus is that the chances are, the range of options is wider on both ends. Trump might be somebody who sponsored real and genuine confrontation. And after all, he did take phone calls from Taiwan early on in his previous presidency, which was a real shock to people in the China policy establishment. So there's the real possibility of confrontation, but there's also the possibility of a deal of some kind, which I don't think was there ever with the Biden administration. At breakfast, one of the things that came up is, in fact, if Trump brings back some of the old team from 2020, their antagonism towards China, which include open talk about regime change, was such that in the end, the Chinese government sanctioned them. So if figures like Pompeo were brought back to prominent positions in Trump's administration, there would be the embarrassment of what to do with the fact that leading figures in American government were persona non grata in China. So there was a kind of tempered reaction, which, but more broadly, I think, clearly amongst the Chinese intellectual class, this confirms the shock that was extremely real in 2016, where for many years, even if you weren't in the regime change liberal kind of camp, nevertheless, Western-orientated Chinese intellectuals, or maybe we should just call cosmopolitan Chinese intellectuals, took American politics extremely seriously as a normative ideal of how to do modern politics. And that was broken in 2016, and surely this outcome will only confirm just how comprehensively that idea, that vision of American power and politics is gone. This was always my message throughout this whole campaign, which is whoever won it, the fact of the matter is this election was close. An election between a fairly cookie-cutter, standard, mainstream candidate like Harris and the increasingly outlandish figure that Trump is, a convicted felon, after all, who really, in some of his campaign speeches, is, rambling in a dangerous way. This was a close election. And in the end, he actually won it. And we think he's going to get, he's going to have a solid popular majority as well for the first time in decades. And that's America. This is, there's no flinching from it. A substantial chunk of Americans chose not to vote at all in this election. And of those that did, the majority voted for that man. And, if you're looking at this from the outside, whether from China or anywhere else, that's the thing to take in. Even if Harris had won, she would have won by the thinnest likely of margins. Biden's victory was tiny, and in Congress, again, wafer thin. One of the effects of this outcome is that it makes that conclusion harder to escape. A Harris win, a narrow Harris win, like the narrow Biden win, would have left folks sort of, I think, still clinging to illusions about what the nature of modern American political culture is. And this outcome robs one of that possibility.
Well, this is the start of the Trump administration, obviously, or the new Trump administration. I imagine we'll be talking about the government in more detail once we know who's in it, etc. So yeah, lots to look forward to in that sense, or look forward to it with some dread perhaps. But otherwise, we will be back next week on our usual time of the week. And see you all then. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.